The rain had been falling since before dawn, the kind of rain that did not announce itself with thunder or lightning, but simply arrived and stayed, steady and indifferent, pressing down on the roof of the small house like a hand refusing to lift. Margaret Calloway sat at the kitchen table with both palms wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. She had not slept. She had not really slept in weeks, not since the funeral, not since the last of the casserole dishes brought by neighbors had been picked up and returned, not since the world had quietly made clear that grief had a social shelf life, and hers had expired. The house around her was the kind of small that felt smaller every year. 2 bedrooms, a bathroom where the tile grout had gone gray and stayed that way no matter how hard she scrubbed. A kitchen with a window above the sink that looked out onto a yard where nothing much had ever grown except crabgrass and one stubborn rosebush that Daniel had planted the spring before he got sick. The rosebush had survived the winter. Daniel had not survived the following one. She turned the mug slowly between her fingers, watching the surface of the cold coffee ripple with the vibration of the old refrigerator. The sound of it had always bothered Daniel. He'd said for 3 years that he was going to fix it. She had not realized until after he was gone how much comfort she'd drawn from hearing him say that, from believing, without really thinking about it, that there would always be a next year for fixing things. There was a folder on the table beside the mug. She had opened and closed it so many times in the past 2 weeks that the edges had gone soft. Inside were numbers, column after column of them, laid out by the bank with a kind of clean, administrative precision that made the disaster feel almost tidy. The mortgage was 4 months behind. The property tax notice had arrived the same week as the final medical bill, as if the two had coordinated their timing deliberately. Daniel's life insurance had covered the funeral and a portion of the debt, but a portion was not enough, and what remained was a number that Margaret could not look at directly for more than a few seconds at a time. She was 53 years old. She had worked 22 years as a school librarian. She had a car with 140,000 miles on it and a checking account balance that she had memorized because she checked it so often it had become a kind of nervous habit, the way some people check the weather or the time. The balance did not improve with checking. Her daughter called every few days from Portland. Her son-in-law was kind in the distant, slightly formal way of people who wanted to help but did not know how. Her daughter, Renata, had offered twice to fly out. Margaret had declined both times. She was not ready to be seen as someone who needed rescuing, though she understood, in the cold, honest part of herself that surfaced at 4 in the morning, that she was precisely that. The rain continued. The refrigerator hummed. The coffee grew colder. She reached for the folder again and pulled out the sheet on the bottom. The one she kept returning to the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. It was a printout from a county auction site. A property listing. She had found it by accident 2 weeks earlier while searching for information about tax deferral programs for low-income homeowners, clicking through links the way you do when you are desperate enough to follow any thread that seems attached to anything at all. The listing was for a property on the eastern edge of Dunmore County, a place she knew only vaguely, the kind of county that appeared on maps, but not in conversations, defined mostly by what it lacked. The property was listed simply as a residential structure on Zero, for acres. The photograph attached to the listing showed a building that the word shack did not quite do justice to, though it came close. The roof sagged on one end. 3 of the 4 visible windows were broken, their frames dark and gaping like missing teeth. The front wall had bowed outward slightly, separating from the foundation in a way that suggested the whole structure was in the slow process of deciding to fall down. The yard was waist-high in dead brush. The asking price at auction was listed as $200 minimum bid. She had stared at that number for a long time the first night she found it. $200. She had $216 in her checking account. She did not bid that night. She told herself it was foolish. She told herself she knew nothing about properties, nothing about repairs, nothing about what a person was supposed to do with zero. For acres of land in a county she had never visited. She told herself that spending her last $200 on a ruined shack was the kind of decision that a person made when they had stopped thinking clearly, when grief and exhaustion had worn the rational mind down to something soft and unreliable. She told herself all of this. And then, On the last morning before the auction closed, she drove to the bank, withdrew $200 in cash, came home, sat back down at this same kitchen table, and placed the bid. She won. There were no other bidders. She sat very still after the confirmation email arrived. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the rain had stopped and left behind a silence that was somehow louder. She looked at the printout of the listing, at the photograph of the sagging roof and the broken windows and the yard full of dead brush. She had just spent everything she had on something that most people would have paid to be rid of. She did not feel foolish, which surprised her. She felt, for the first time in months, like she had done something. It didn't matter if it was the wrong thing. It was something. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She would go see it the following Saturday. The drive to Dunmore County took just over 2 hours, most of it on state routes that narrowed progressively until the last 15 miles, which were on roads that had names on maps, but not on signs. The landscape changed gradually, opening up from the suburban spread around her own town into something older and emptier. Farmland that had been worked and then left. Tree lines that had grown back over fields. A few properties set well back from the road, their driveways long and unpaved, their houses barely visible. Margaret drove with the printed directions on the passenger seat because her phone lost signal about 20 minutes outside of town. The radio drifted in and out. She turned it off and drove in silence. She almost missed the turn. There was no mailbox, no visible address marker. Just a break in the tree line and 2 shallow ruts in the ground that had once been a driveway. She slowed, looked at the directions, looked at the ruts, and turned in. The driveway was about 100 yards long. The brush on either side had grown high enough to scrape the doors of the car as she moved through it. She went slowly, feeling the uneven ground through the steering wheel. At the end of the ruts, the trees opened and she saw it. The photograph had been accurate, which she supposed was something. The house, the word sat uneasily, but she kept using it, was a single-story structure, perhaps 800 square feet, built from wood that had once been painted white and now showed the paint only in flaking strips, the rest having gone gray and soft with age and exposure. The roof line was indeed lower on the left end, where several boards had given way and left a gap that exposed the interior to the sky. The broken windows she had seen in the photograph were worse up close. The glass had not just cracked. It had been gone so long that the frames had warped and the openings had filled partway with blown-in debris, leaves and bird-nesting material, and fine gray dust. The front door was closed, but not locked. A length of wire had been looped through the latch as a makeshift security measure. She unwound it, pushed the door inward, and waited for a moment before stepping in. The interior smelled of mildew and old wood and something faintly chemical that she could not immediately place, something that reminded her of nail polish remover or old varnish. The floor was visible in places and covered in debris in others. Leaf had drifted in through the broken windows and settled in low piles along the baseboards. The walls showed water, staining in long vertical streaks from the ceiling down. In the kitchen area, the cabinets had been stripped of their doors, either by vandals or by a previous occupant who had needed them for something else. She walked through slowly, hands in her pockets, not touching anything yet, just looking. There was something about the proportions of the space that surprised her. The layout was unusual. The main room was deeper than it appeared from outside, stretching back further than the exterior dimensions suggested it should. She counted her paces. It didn't make complete sense, but she attributed it to disorientation, to the low light and the clutter and the strangeness of being somewhere so entirely foreign. The back wall of the main room had been partially covered at some point with a large wooden panel, the kind that might have hidden a utility space or a closet. The panel had come loose from one side and hung at an angle, revealing darkness behind it. She reached out and pushed it further aside, expecting to find a shallow alcove, maybe old shelving. Instead, there was nothing, just wall. And then she looked down. At the base of the wall, almost entirely concealed by the hanging panel and by the debris on the floor, was the outline of something set into the floorboards. A rectangle, roughly 3 feet by 4 feet. The edges were defined by a thin gap, uniform on all sides, too regular to be a natural crack in old wood. She crouched and brushed the debris away with her sleeve. A floor panel, a hatch of some kind, set flush with the floor, its edges sealed with what had once been a rubber gasket now dried and cracked. There was no visible handle, but one end had a small depression worn smooth, a finger hold for lifting. She stood up and looked at it for a moment. She thought about the farmer who had heard sounds beneath his land and found a door under the soil. She thought about the particular quality of discovery, the way it changed the air in a place. She thought about Daniel, who had loved stories about hidden rooms and buried histories. He would have been on his knees already. She was not quite ready for that. Not yet. She took out her phone, remembered it had no signal, and put away. She looked around the rest of the room, and then she looked back at the panel on the floor. She found an old piece of wood in the debris, a length of lath, and used it to probe the edges of the hatch. It was solid. Whatever was below, it was not hollow in the way of a simple crawl space. The sound when she tapped was dull and deep, not the flat resonance of empty air close to the surface. She made herself leave it. She walked back through the house, out the front door, and stood in the overgrown yard, looking at the building. She thought about $200. She thought about the folder on her kitchen table and the numbers in it. She thought about the rosebush Daniel had planted and how it had survived a winter that he hadn't. She drove home with her hands steady on the wheel and the silence of the county roads around her, and the image of that hatch and the floor sitting in the front of her mind, where it stayed for the entire drive, and well into the night and through the following morning, refusing, with a kind of quiet insistence, to go anywhere at all. She did not tell anyone about the hatch. She was not entirely sure why. She told Renata on their next phone call that she had purchased a small property in Dunmore County, and Renata was quiet for a moment and then said, carefully, that she hadn't realized Mom was thinking about real estate. Margaret said she hadn't been, exactly. She said it was a project, something to do. Renata asked if she was all right, which was the question Renata always asked and which always meant something larger than it said. Margaret said she was fine and changed the subject. She went back the following weekend with more supplies. A proper flashlight, the heavy kind with a long beam. A crowbar. Work gloves. A dust mask. A thermos of coffee and a sandwich she ate in the car before going in because she did not think the kitchen was safe enough to eat in and because she wanted to be already past hunger before she started. The house was exactly as she had left it. That should not have surprised her, but it did slightly, the way abandoned places always seem like they might have changed in your absence, as if they have some interior life of their own that continues without witnesses. She went directly to the back wall, to the loose panel and the hatch beneath. She cleared the debris properly this time, all of it, using a piece of cardboard to sweep the area around the hatch until she had a clear view of the full rectangle. In the better light of the powerful flashlight, she could see details she had missed before. The hatch was not simply a piece of cut flooring. It was a deliberate construction. The edges had been finished, the wood along the frame slightly thicker than the surrounding floor, reinforced from below in a way that was only faintly visible but unmistakable once she saw it. Someone had built this to be used, and then someone had hidden it. She fitted the crowbar into the fingerhold depression and applied steady, measured pressure. The hatch resisted, not violently, but firmly, the way things resist when they have been sealed by time rather than by any deliberate locking mechanism. She applied more pressure, felt the edge lift fractionally, applied more, with a sound that was less a crack than a long exhalation, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for years and had finally been given permission to let it out. The hatch came. Free. Cold air rose from below. The flashlight beam dropped down into a shaft, a staircase, wooden steps descending into darkness at a shallow angle, built against the side of a space whose floor she could see from above. Concrete. Dry. The same faintly chemical smell she had noticed in the house, stronger now, clean rather than unpleasant. Like old lacquer, like a room that had been sealed rather than simply closed. She sat back on her heels and breathed. The steps were 7 in number. She counted them from above before descending. They were built solidly, not improvised, the risers consistent, the treads wide enough to step on comfortably. The wood showed no rot. Whoever had built this had built it to last. She went down slowly, one hand on the wall to the right of the staircase, flashlight in the other hand, the beams sweeping ahead of her. The space opened as she descended, widening from the narrow width of the staircase into a room that was, she realized with a jolt of astonishment, large. Not vast, but large. Perhaps 30 feet by 20. Low ceiling, perhaps 7 feet, concrete throughout, walls and floor, and ceiling all poured or cast in place. No windows, which she had expected. But the ventilation was evident, small grills set high in 2 of the walls, their screens intact, connected to ductwork that disappeared upward through the ceiling. She stood at the base of the stairs and turned slowly, the flashlight beam moving with her. The room was not empty. Along the far wall, built-in shelving ran floor to ceiling, the shelves themselves made from the same careful, finished wood as the staircase. On the shelves were objects. She could not see them clearly from across the room, but she could see that there were many of them, arranged with deliberate care, and that the arrangement spoke of organization rather than accumulation. Not the random deposition of junk. Something else. To her left, a workbench, long and solid, its surface worn smooth by use and time. A pegboard above it with outlines where tools had once hung, most of them gone, but a few remaining, old tools with wooden handles darkened by years of contact with hands. To her right, something covered by canvas drop cloths. Several somethings. The shapes beneath the canvas were irregular, some tall and thin, some flat and horizontal, none of them immediately identifiable. She stood very still in the center of the room and listened to the silence. It was a particular quality of silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of age. The room had been closed for a long time, not abandoned, she thought, with a precision that surprised her. Sealed. There was a distinction. Abandoned spaces accumulated disorder. This one had been left in order, which meant someone had taken care before closing it. She moved to the shelves first because they were the most immediately visible. The flashlight beam resolved the shapes on them as she drew closer. Boxes, small wooden ones, their lids fitted tightly, their surfaces marked with handwritten labels in a script that was small and even and slightly faded. She reached for the nearest one and turned it in her hands. The label read a date and a set of letters that meant nothing to her immediately. She set it down and reached for another. Beside the boxes were larger objects. Flat cases in dark leather, the kind that held sets of things, instruments or tools, their clasps tarnished to a deep brown. She opened the nearest one carefully. Inside, nested in velvet that had once been dark green and had faded to something closer to gray, were coins. Rows of them, each one in its own fitted depression. She picked one up and held it in the flashlight beam. Gold. The weight of it was immediate and unmistakable, a density that common metal did not have. The surface showed a profile, a date, lettering she had to turn the coin to read. Old. She did not know how old exactly, but old in the way that the weight and the color and the worn softness of the relief told you before you even try to read a date. She counted the coins in the case without picking them all up, just running her finger along the rows, counting the depressions. 48. She set the case down and looked along the shelf at the other cases. There were 14 of them on this shelf alone, all the same size, all the same dark leather. And 3 more shelves above this one. And to the left of the coin cases, the wooden boxes whose labels she had only begun to read. She sat down on the bottom step of the staircase because her legs had gone uncertain beneath her. The flashlight was still in her hand, and she held it pointed at the floor, the beam creating a circle of light around her feet, and she sat there for what might have been 2 minutes or might have been 10. She was not frightened. She was not quite anything she had a word for. She felt the weight of the coin she was still holding in her left hand. She had not realized she had kept it, and she turned it slowly between her fingers. She thought about $200. She thought about the folder with the numbers. She thought about Daniel saying he would fix the refrigerator next year. She stood up and went back to the shelving and began, slowly and methodically, to open the wooden boxes. The first one contained paper currency. Old bills, bound in small packets with strips of paper, each strip marked with a denomination and account. The bills were not common. She recognized none of the faces on them, and several were not in English. She placed the box carefully on the workbench and opened the next one. Stamps. Thousands of them, arranged in glassine envelopes in rows, each envelope labeled in the same small, even script. She held one envelope up to the flashlight and looked at the stamps inside. Rows of tiny rectangles, their colors still vivid despite the decades, their perforations clean. She knew nothing about stamps, but she knew what preservation looked like, and these had been preserved with the same careful intention as everything else in the room. She opened boxes steadily, one after another, and what she found continued to accumulate in her mind in a way that her immediate comprehension could not quite process. More currency. Bonds, she thought, though she could not be certain, documents of some kind printed on heavy paper with official-looking seals. Several small wooden trays lined with the same faded velvet as the coin cases, these ones containing gemstones loose and labeled in small paper envelopes, each envelope marked in the same careful hand. She came to the canvas-draped objects on the right side of the room last. She lifted the edge of the nearest drop cloth and looked underneath. Paintings, framed and stacked, face-to-face with cloth between each one to protect the surfaces. She eased the top one free carefully, holding it in the flashlight beam. The canvas was dark with age at the edges, but the interior of the image was still vivid. A landscape, thick application of paint. The kind of brushwork she associated with the imprecision of someone who had spent more time in libraries than in galleries, with work that was old in a serious way. She leaned it carefully against the workbench and went back for the next one. A portrait, a woman in dark clothing, her expression composed and direct. Then another landscape, larger. Then a small panel painting, not canvas but wood. Its surface cracked in the fine web pattern she thought she had read was called craquelure, the natural aging of old paint. She did not count them all. There were many. They continued behind the drop cloths in ranks she had not yet uncovered. She stood in the center of the room again, surrounded now by the things she had moved to look at more closely. The open coin cases on the shelf, the wooden boxes on the workbench, the paintings leaning against the wall, and she turned the flashlight slowly around the room and understood, with a certainty that arrived, not as a shock, but as a slow, enormous weight settling around her, that she was standing inside something that was not supposed to exist. This was not a storm cellar. It was not a root cellar. It was not a space built for utility or emergency. It was a vault, built with precision, ventilated and sealed, designed to preserve its contents across decades, possibly longer. Built beneath a house that had then been allowed, or encouraged, to fall into ruin. Made invisible by neglect, by the brush grown high in the yard, by the sagging roof and the broken windows that told anyone who might have passed by that this was nothing worth stopping for. $200. She climbed the stairs back up into the ruined kitchen and sat on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit. The boards around her soft and debris-covered and faintly alarming in their structural uncertainty. And she sat with the flashlight off to save the batteries and the gray October light coming through the broken windows, and she pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed. She thought about calling Renata. She reached for her phone and remembered there was no signal. She thought about what she knew, which was very little. She knew there was a room under the floor. She knew the room contained things that appeared to be valuable. She knew nothing about their actual value, their provenance, their legal status, who had put them here, or what any of it meant. She knew that she had paid $200 for this property at a county auction and that the transaction was filed and documented and entirely legal. She sat with all of this for a long time. Then she stood up, went back downstairs, and spent the next 2 hours moving through the room systematically, opening every container, examining every object, not touching anything she didn't need to touch, building in her mind the most complete inventory she could of what was here. By the time she climbed back upstairs and rewound the wire through the latch on the front door and walked to her car through the dead brush of the yard, the late afternoon light was going orange and low through the trees. She sat in the driver's seat for several minutes without starting the engine. The coin she had been holding was still in her coat pocket. She took it out and turned it in the last of the daylight. Gold caught the light differently than other metals. Warmer, more patient. She put in the cup holder between the seats, started the engine, and drove out through the ruts and back onto the county road. She did not tell anyone. Not yet. She had 3 things to do before she told anyone anything. She needed to understand what she had found. She needed to know if any of it was legitimate, legally hers, free of claim. And she needed to find out who had built that room and what they had put in it, and why they had then left it to be swallowed by a county auction for $200 minimum bid. She drove home through the darkening afternoon with the heater on and the radio still off, and the weight of the room beneath the floor sitting in the front of her mind like a stone that was warmer than it should have been and heavier than anything she had lifted in years. And she thought about Daniel, who had loved hidden things, who had always said that the world was full of forgotten rooms if you were patient enough to look. She thought he would have laughed. A long, real, fully delighted laugh, the kind that had been her favorite sound for 30 years. She pressed her fingers against her eyes briefly at a stoplight, and then the light changed, and she drove on. She would go back Thursday. She would bring better lights and a better camera and a notebook. She would begin at the beginning. She went back Thursday as she had promised herself, and again on the Saturday after that. And on the following Tuesday, she called in sick to work for the first time in 11 years. Not because she was ill, but because she could not sit in the library and process holds and answer referent questions while what was beneath the floor of that ruined house in Dunmore County continued to exist without being understood. She went on that Tuesday, too. She was developing a rhythm of it. Each visit, she brought something new. The second visit, she brought a proper camera, her old digital one she had not used since before Daniel got sick, and she photographed everything in the room systematically, wall by wall, shelf by shelf, every individual case and box and canvas-covered stack. She numbered the photographs and wrote descriptions in the notebook she carried, small cramped notes made by flashlight, her handwriting worse than usual in the cold. The room was cold, not dramatically, not dangerously, but consistently cool in the way of spaces that don't exchange air with the surface world. And after an hour below, she could feel it in her hands and her shoulders. She had started wearing an extra layer. She had started bringing hand warmers. The third visit she spent primarily on the workbench area, examining the object she had not yet opened, a locked metal box she eventually got open with a thin piece of metal from her car's emergency kit, and inside it a set of documents, folded and sealed in oilskin, their condition remarkable given whatever age they represented. She did not unfold them. She photographed them in place, sealed in their oilskin, and made a note. The fourth visit, the Tuesday she had called in sick, she spent on the paintings. She moved each one out from behind the drop cloths and propped it against the wall in the best light she could manage with 2 flashlights and a lantern she had purchased specifically for this purpose. She photographed each painting individually, full frame and detail shots of any visible signatures or inscriptions. Some had labels on the back, old paper labels with handwriting or printed stamps. She photographed those too. She did not know what most of it was. That was the central fact of her situation, the one she kept returning to. She was sitting in the middle of something enormous, and she lacked almost entirely the knowledge required to understand it. She knew the coins were gold. She could see that. She knew the paintings were old. She could see that too. She knew the stamps had been preserved with a care that suggested they mattered. She knew the documents in the oilskin had been protected deliberately. What she did not know was value. Not in any precise sense. Not in the sense that mattered for the decisions she was going to have to make. She needed an expert. Several of them, probably. And the moment she brought in an expert, the room ceased to be her secret. That was the calculation she kept making. She turned it over on the drive home each time, examining it from different angles the way you examine an object you're thinking of purchasing, looking for the flaw, the catch, the thing that will change your mind. There was a woman named Dolores Fitch who had worked with Margaret at the library for 9 years before retiring. Dolores had spent her retirement taking courses, which was entirely in character for a librarian. She had taken courses in art history, in antiques appraisal, in genealogical research. She was 71 years old, sharp as a newly sharpened pencil, and deeply discreet in the manner of people who have spent their working lives surrounded by other people's private inquiries. Margaret had not seen Dolores in 4 months. She called her on a Wednesday evening from her kitchen table. Dolores picked up on the second ring and said Margaret's name with the warm, particular pleasure of someone who genuinely meant it, and Margaret felt the tightness in her chest ease fractionally, enough to let her speak. She said she had found something. She said she needed advice from someone who knew about art and antiques and old objects. She said she couldn't explain the full situation on the phone. She said she was sorry to be mysterious, and she knew it sounded strange. Dolores was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It doesn't sound strange at all. It sounds like you found something real. When do you want me to come?" They drove out together the following Saturday. Dolores sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap and asked only practical questions. How large was the space? What kind of lighting would they need? Were the stairs stable? She had brought her own flashlight and a magnifying glass and a small notebook identical in format to the one Margaret had been using, which made Margaret feel, unexpectedly, like crying. When they descended the stairs and Dolores stood at the base and turned slowly in the beam of her flashlight, she was quiet for a long time. Not the silence of someone at a loss. The silence of someone concentrating. She went first to the paintings. She stood before each one for several minutes, the magnifying glass coming out for closer work, her flashlight held at different angles to catch the surface texture. She did not touch the paint, but she touched the frames, the backs of the panels, the labels. She murmured to herself occasionally, sounds that were not words, the verbal equivalent of a nod. After 40 minutes with the paintings, she straightened and turned to Margaret, and her face in the lantern light was composed and serious and entirely calm, and she said quietly, "Several of these are significant." The word significant, in Dolores's vocabulary, Margaret had learned over 9 years of working proximity, was not a small word. She moved to the coins next. She opened the cases one by one and held coins to the light and read dates and inscriptions and made notes. Her handwriting in the notebook was fast and precise. She asked Margaret if she could photograph certain coins directly, and Margaret handed her the camera and watched her work. The stamps took another half hour. Dolores held envelopes up to the light with a stillness that reminded Margaret of a doctor reading an X-ray, a professional silence in which conclusions were being drawn that the observer was not yet being told. When she had worked through everything she could work through in that session, she closed her notebook and stood in the center of the room and looked at the shelves and the workbench and the paintings, and she did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Margaret, you need to understand something about what's in this room." Margaret said she was trying to. Dolores said, "I'm going to need to do some research before I can give you reliable information about specific values. But I can tell you, right now, standing here, that this is not a small discovery. Some of these paintings, if they are what I think they may be, and I want to be careful about that word may, are the kind of paintings that belong in museums. The coins include several I have not seen outside of auction catalogs. The stamps, some of them, are the kind that collectors spend careers pursuing." Margaret said, "How did this get here?" Dolores said, "I don't know yet. But whoever put this here knew exactly what they had." They drove home mostly in silence, the comfortable silence of people who have seen the same thing and are still absorbing it. Outside the county, the signal returned to Margaret's phone, and it buzzed several times with messages she did not look at. She kept both hands on the wheel. When she dropped Dolores at her house, Dolores got out of the car and then leaned back in through the open door and said, "You're all right, you know. Whatever happens, you're all right." Margaret drove the rest of the way home alone. She sat at the kitchen table that night with the notebook open in front of her and the camera beside it, and she thought about the numbers in the folder she had largely stopped looking at. The mortgage, the medical bills, the tax notice. She thought about Renata in Portland asking carefully if she was all right. She thought about the checking account balance she checked too many times a day. She thought about Daniel, who had planted a rose bush and said he'd fix the refrigerator next year. She did not let herself think too directly about the room or what was in it or what it might mean. That felt premature and also faintly dangerous, like counting on weather. She went to bed at 11 and lay awake until 2 and then slept suddenly and deeply, which was the best sleep she'd had in months. Dolores called 4 days later. She had spent the intervening time, she explained, going through auction records and catalog databases she had access to through a professional appraisers association she belonged to as an associate member. She had also called a friend, a man named Alton Webb, who had spent 30 years as a senior cataloger for a major auction house before retiring to teach. She had described certain objects in general terms without revealing their location or how they had been found. Alton, Dolores said, was very interested in the painting descriptions. Margaret asked what very interested meant. Dolores said, he asked if he could see photographs. I told him possibly, pending the owner's decision. Margaret turned this over. The photographs were on her camera. She had not yet uploaded them anywhere. She had been holding the camera like something fragile. She said, what do you think I should do? Dolores said, I think you should talk to a lawyer first, before you show the photographs to anyone, before you do anything official. You need to understand your legal position, what the auction purchase means for ownership, whether there are any prior claims possible on contents found within a purchased property. That comes before anything else. Margaret said she didn't have a lawyer. Dolores said, I know one. She gave Margaret a name and a phone number. Then she said, he's discreet. I would not have given you his number otherwise. Margaret wrote it down. The lawyer's name was Gerald Parr. He had a small practice in a town about 40 minutes from Margaret's house, a practice that dealt mostly in property and estate matters, the quiet work of people's lives organized on paper. He was in his 60s, methodical, with the particular patience of a man who had spent decades listening to people explain complicated situations and had learned not to rush them. Margaret sat in his office on a Thursday afternoon and told him everything, from the auction listing to the $200 bid to the hatch and the floor to Dolores and the silent 40 minutes in front of the paintings. She had brought the camera and showed him the photographs, scrolling through them on the small screen while he leaned forward with his reading glasses on and said nothing. When she finished, he sat back and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, property purchased at a properly conducted county tax auction conveys full legal title to the buyer. That includes the structure and all fixtures and contents found therein, provided those contents are not subject to a prior legal claim. Meaning, if someone can establish that specific items were stolen or subject to an existing legal judgment, that claim could potentially supersede your ownership of those specific items. Margaret said, and if no such claim exists, he said, then what's in that room is yours. He said he would research the property's history, the chain of title, any existing liens or claims, and the auction process itself to ensure there were no procedural irregularities. He said this would take a week or two. He said in the meantime, she should not move anything from the property, should not bring anyone else to see it, and should not discuss it with anyone she had not already told. She thought of Mark, the farmer's friend from the story she kept returning to in her mind, the phone call made too soon. She said she understood. She had told only Dolores. Dolores she trusted. She drove home from Gerald Parr's office feeling something she had not expected to feel at this stage of the process. Not excitement, not hope exactly, but solidity, the kind of groundedness that comes from having taken a correct step, from having done the next thing in the right order. The refrigerator hummed when she got home. She stood in the kitchen and listened to it and thought, for the first time in almost a year, that she did not feel like the hum was accusatory. She called Renata that evening. She did not tell her about the room. She asked how the children were and listened to the answer and asked follow-up questions and laughed twice at things that were genuinely funny. When Renata asked how she was, she said, I'm working on something. I think it might be good. I'll tell you more when I know more. Renata said, that sounds different. Margaret said, I think it is a little. 2 weeks into Gerald Parr's research, Dolores came by the house one evening, and they sat at the kitchen table with tea, and Dolores spread out the notes she had been compiling, her handwriting filling pages in her precise rapid script, source notations in the margins the way librarians made notes, a habit that did not leave you. She said, I've been working through the paintings as carefully as I can from the photographs. Alton has been helping me, still without knowing where the photographs came from. I told him they were from an estate I was consulting on. She said, there are at least 3 of the paintings that I believe are attributable to specific artists, painters of significant historical reputation, whose works appear in major collections. I'm using the word believe carefully because without physical examination, I can't be certain, and even with physical examination, you'd want multiple experts in laboratory analysis. But the stylistic evidence, the materials visible in the photographs, And in 2 cases, the labels on the backs of the frames are consistent with attribution. Margaret asked who the artists were. Dolores told her. The names were not unfamiliar. Margaret had checked books from her own library's art section often enough in the past 2 weeks that the names resonated now with the particular weight of things you have recently learned to take seriously. She said, and the coins. Dolores said, the gold coins include several series that are extraordinarily rare. The kind of rare that doesn't appear at auction more than once a decade. Alton said, when I described them without telling him where they were from, that if they were genuine, they would generate serious competition. Margaret said, and the stamps. Dolores looked at her and said, the stamps are in some ways the most remarkable element. Stamps, she explained, were among the most aggressively preserved and cataloged collectibles in the world. Rarity was precisely documented. Values were tracked obsessively, and several of the stamps visible in the photographs, particularly as said in one of the earlier envelopes she had opened, were stamps that the philatelic community considered to be either extremely rare or, in certain cases, theoretically unaccounted for, missing from known collections. Margaret sat with this. She said, what are we talking about? In terms of total value, if everything is genuine. Dolores said, I want to be very careful here because I'm not an accredited appraiser and the numbers I can give you are based on comparative research, not formal assessment. Margaret said, I understand. I just want to understand the scale of what I'm looking at. Dolores was quiet for a moment. Then she said that in her research, the paintings alone, if the attributions held, could represent a combined value in the many tens of millions of dollars range. The coins and stamps and documents added substantially to that. The total, she said, depending on how many of her preliminary attributions prove correct under formal assessment, could be very large. She did not say a number. She said very large and let it sit there in the kitchen between them. Margaret looked at the folder on the table, the one with the bank numbers, which she had left there so long it had become almost part of the furniture. She looked at it, and then she looked at Dolores. Dolores said one more thing. She opened her notebook to a page she had marked with a folded corner. She said, I did some research on the property history. The county records only go back so far, and some of the earlier records are incomplete, but I found reference to the property being in the possession of a family named Varek. The name appears in county tax records going back to the 1940s, and then stops appearing in the early 1980s, which is consistent with the property having passed through tax default at some point, which is how it eventually reached the auction you purchased it from. Margaret said, Varek. Dolores said yes. And then she said, I did some searching on the name in connection with the region's history. There was a man with that surname who appears in several local historical references from the mid-20th century, described variously as an art dealer, a private collector, and at one point, in a newspaper item for 1962, as an importer of European cultural objects. Margaret thought about this. She said, he brought things back, and he hid them here. Dolores said, that's one interpretation. Margaret said, and then either he died or he left, and no one knew what was under the floor. Dolores said, or someone knew and chose not to say. Or someone knew and died before they could say. Or someone knew and was waiting for the right moment, and the moment never came. Margaret looked at the cold kitchen window, at the darkness outside it, at the reflection of the two of them sitting at the table with their notebooks and their tea. She thought about a man she had never met who had built a room under a ruined house and filled it with beautiful and valuable and carefully preserved things, and then disappeared from the county records and left it all behind in the dark. She thought about the silence of it, the patience of it, the way a secret could outlast the person keeping it by decades. She said, do you think there are claims on any of it? Dolores said, Gerald would know better than I would. But the Varek name doesn't appear in any legal proceedings I could find. No estate filed in the county records. No heirs that I can identify. The property went through tax default unchallenged, which suggests no one was watching it. Margaret said, or no one who was watching it wanted to come forward. Dolores said yes. That too. They sat for a while longer. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the rose bush in the yard was bare for winter, its canes thin and dark, waiting. Margaret refilled their tea. She said, when Gerald finishes his research, what's the next step? Dolores said, formal appraisal. accredited assessors for each category. It will take time and it won't be inexpensive, but it has to be done properly. And then, depending on the appraisals and on Gerald's findings about title, you decide how to proceed. Margaret said, I have $216. Dolores said, I know. But Alton has offered to provide an initial assessment at no charge in exchange for the opportunity to be involved in the formal process. He called it the most interesting thing he'd been told about in 30 years of work. Margaret almost smiled. She said, 30 years. Dolores said, he got quite animated, actually. For Alton, that means he used 4 syllables instead of 2. Margaret laughed. It was a small laugh, cautious in the way of things returning after a long absence. But it was real, and Dolores heard it and smiled. Margaret looked at the folder with the bank numbers. She did not open it. She just looked at it for a moment, and then she looked away. She said, all right. When Gerald calls, we move forward. Outside, the rose bush stood patient and bare in the dark yard, its roots reaching down through cold soil, holding on. Margaret turned off the kitchen light when Dolores left and stood for a moment in the dark before going to bed. The room smelled of tea and old paper and the particular ordinariness of her own life. The life she had been living while everything was accumulating below a ruined floor 40 miles away. $200. She had spent everything she had, and what she had bought was a room that had been waiting longer than she had been alive, sealed under the dark, holding its breath. She thought about that, about patience, about the way certain things waited without anxiety, without resentment, simply waited because waiting was what the situation required. She went to bed and slept without lying awake first, which was the second good night's sleep she had had in nearly a year, and which felt, in the arithmetic of her current life, like something close to abundance. She would go back Thursday. She would bring better lights. She would begin, properly this time, at the very beginning. Gerald Parr called on a Monday morning while Margaret was shelving returns in the library's fiction section, her cart half empty and the building quiet around her in the particular way of libraries before noon, when the day had not yet gathered its people. She felt the phone vibrate in her pocket and looked at the screen and stepped into the back hallway where the staff bathroom was and the storage shelves and the quiet that was several degrees deeper than the quiet of the main floor. Gerald said he had completed his research on the property title. He said his findings were, on the whole, favorable. He said he wanted to go through them with her in person, and could she come to his office Thursday? She said yes and thanked him and stood in the back hallway for a moment after the call ended, her hands still around the phone, the shelving cart waiting on the other side of the door. She breathed in the smell of the back hallway, which was dust and cleaning solution and old cardboard, the smell of the accumulation of ordinary institutional days, and she thought about Thursday and felt something she recognized after a moment as hope, not the fragile tentative variety she had been rationing carefully for months, but something more structural, something that felt like it had a foundation under it. She pushed back through the door and finished shelving the returns. Gerald's office on Thursday was warm and smelled of coffee and the particular paper smell of files that had been handled many times. He had a folder open on his desk and his reading glasses already on, and he walked her through his findings in the methodical, unhurried way she had come to associate with him, laying each element down in sequence, one upon the other, the way you build something that needs to hold weight. The property had passed through 3 tax default cycles over the preceding decades before reaching the county auction. In each previous cycle, it had been redeemed at the last moment by a party identified in the records only as a fiduciary agent acting on behalf of an unnamed interest. The final cycle, the one that had ended with the auction Margaret had found and bid on, had not been redeemed. The fiduciary agent had not appeared. The property had passed to county custody and then to auction in full accordance with established procedure. Margaret asked about the fiduciary agent, whether there was a name, a firm, something that could be traced. Gerald said they're having a law firm. He had found the name in older records. He had made inquiries. The firm had dissolved in the late 90s. Its principals were dead or untraceable. He had found no successor entity and no record of any ongoing claim or interest related to the Dunmore County property. He said, what this means in practical terms is that the chain of title is clean. Your purchase at auction was legally valid and fully documented. There is no surviving entity with a recognized legal interest in the property or its contents. Margaret said, and the contents specifically, the things in the room. He said, property law in this state holds that contents found within a purchased property and not subject to a prior documented legal claim are the property of the purchaser. I have researched whether any of the categories of objects you described to me are subject to specific legal regimes that might affect this. For example, certain categories of cultural heritage objects can be subject to international conventions or repatriation claims. I want to be clear that formal appraisal and provenance research will be important here, particularly for the paintings. If any of them have a provenance that connects them to wartime looting or forced sales, there are legal and ethical dimensions that would need to be addressed. Margaret said, I want to address them. Gerald looked at her over his glasses. She said, I'm not asking how to avoid it. I'm saying if any of that applies to any of these things, I want to know and I want to do what's right. I just need to know what I'm dealing with first. He nodded once. He said, that's the correct approach, and it makes the rest of this significantly simpler. He closed the folder and folded his hands on top of it. He said, my recommendation is that you proceed with formal appraisal and provenance research conducted by accredited specialists. That process will take several months. It will generate a complete picture of what you have and what, if any, obligations or considerations attach to specific items. Once that picture is complete, you'll be in a position to make decisions about next steps, whether that's sale, donation, restitution of specific items, or some combination. He said, in the meantime, the property and its contents should be secured. The current structure is not adequate. I'd recommend a professional security installation and environmental controls for the room itself, given the nature of the contents. Margaret thought about her checking account balance. She said the cost of that. He said, Dolores mentioned Alton Webb's offer. I've spoken with him briefly. He has connections to a foundation that funds provenance research and conservation work in cases of significant cultural interest. He believes this situation would qualify. There may be resources available that don't require you to bear all costs up front. Margaret sat with this for a moment. She thought about the careful way the room had been arranged, the ventilation grills, the oilskin wrapping on the documents, the velvet line cases for the coins. Whoever had built that room had done everything right to preserve what was in it across decades. It had worked. It had worked because of precision and care and the patient understanding that what mattered should be protected even when no one was watching. She said, all right, let's begin. Alton Webb was a small man in his late 70s with the contained energy of someone who had spent a long career learning to be still around fragile things. He arrived at the property on a gray November morning in a car that was modest and unremarkable, which Margaret had somehow expected, and he stood in the overgrown yard looking at the ruined house for a moment before saying anything. Then he said, the concealment was deliberate. You can see it in the condition gradient. The house was allowed to deteriorate specifically, maintained just enough not to collapse and draw official attention, but presented as worthless to discourage interest. Margaret said, you think someone was maintaining it. He said, someone was managing the tax redemptions for 40 years. That's not passive. That's active concealment. Someone knew what was here and kept it hidden and kept it preserved and then at some point stopped. He descended the stairs into the room and was quiet for a long time. He moved through the space the way Dolores had moved through it, with the focused economy of a professional, but slower. He spent nearly an hour with the paintings alone, taking his own photographs, making notes in a system of abbreviations that Margaret could not read over his shoulder. He held coins to a small portable UV light he had brought in his bag. He opened stamp envelopes with cotton gloves and a precision that reminded Margaret of surgery. When he came back up the stairs, he stood in the ruined kitchen and looked at the floor and then at Margaret and said, I've worked in this field for 53 years. I want you to understand that when I say that, I'm giving you context for what I'm about to tell you. She said she understood. He said, there are 4 paintings in that room that I believe, pending laboratory confirmation, to be works of significant historical and financial importance. I recognized 3 of them from catalog records, not reproductions. not copies. I believe they are the works themselves. One of them I have been looking for in the professional sense for over 20 years. It was listed as displaced during wartime movement of a private collection. I had assumed it was gone. Margaret said, displaced meaning. He said, the history of European art collections in the mid-20th century is complicated and painful. Objects moved through many hands during that period, sometimes through sale, sometimes through seizure, sometimes through what was technically legal transaction conducted under conditions that were anything but. Provenance research in these cases requires careful work. I want to be clear that your ownership of the property does not resolve the ethical questions that may attach to specific objects. Those questions need to be asked and answered honestly. She said, I know. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, yes, I think you do. He said the stamps included 3 items he had believed to be unique surviving examples of issues printed in limited runs that had not been seen at public auction in decades. He said the coin collection was among the most complete and well-preserved assemblages of certain gold series he had encountered in private circumstances. He said the documents in the oilskin wrapping, which he had carefully opened with her permission, were financial instruments, bonds issued by institutions that no longer existed in their original form, but whose obligations had in several cases been assumed by successor entities. He said, I can give you a preliminary range for the total assessed value. He paused. He said this was imprecise, and she should understand it would be refined substantially by formal process. She said she understood. He said the range he would put forward based on comparable sales and catalog values for objects at this level was between $280 and $360 million. He said if the provenance on 2 of the paintings resolved cleanly and they came to market at a major house, the upper end of that range could be exceeded. The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret looked at the floor. The soft gray boards, the debris along the baseboards, the gap where the hatch was closed again. She said $340 million was the number she had written at the top of her notebook on the first night, just to give herself something to orient around, a number that had felt fantastical when she wrote it. Alton said nothing. She said the provenance research. How long? He said 6 to 12 months for a thorough process. He said the foundation he had mentioned to Gerald had agreed, in principle, to fund the research and the conservation work. He said there would be no cost to her for that phase. She said, and if some of the objects have claims against them. He said, then those claims are honored. That is how it works when it is done correctly. He said there were organizations, heirs, institutions, families who had spent generations looking for things that had been taken from them. He said that returning such things, when the research supported it, was not a loss. It was a resolution. He said some people in her position had found that the process of restitution, conducted honestly, had made the remainder of what they held more valuable, not less, in every sense of the word. Margaret thought about a man named Varek who had been an importer of European cultural objects and whose name had appeared in the county records until the early 1980s and then disappeared. She thought about what a man like that might have known and what he might have been trying to do with what he knew. She thought about the care of the room, the velvet-lined cases, the oilskin wrapping, the ventilation grills. The patience of it. She thought maybe he had been trying to keep things safe until they could be returned. Maybe the keeping had outlasted the returning. Maybe the room had been waiting not for someone to take what was in it, but for someone to understand what to do with it. She might be wrong about that. She held it lightly. She said, let's do it right. The security installation took 2 weeks. The company Gerald recommended worked discreetly and without asking the questions that less professional outfits might have asked. Environmental controls were added to the underground room, humidity management and temperature stabilization, the kind of systems used in archival storage. The objects remained exactly in place throughout. Nothing was moved until the formal appraisers arrived. The appraisers came in November and December, specialists in different categories, a numismatist from a university collection, a philatelist who had been called as an expert witness in international proceedings, 2 art historians with conservation backgrounds, a document specialist who worked primarily with institutional archives. They came one at a time or in pairs, and each of them was quiet in the room in the way that Dolores and Alton had been quiet, the particular silence of professional attention. Margaret was present for each visit. She had stopped calling in sick and started using her vacation days, which she had accumulated in sufficient quantity over 11 years of almost never taking them. She stood in the background during the assessments and watched and listened and asked questions when they seemed appropriate and held her notebook and wrote things down. One of the art historians, a woman named Dr. Priametta, who specialized in mid-century European provenance, spent 3 visits in the room over 2 weeks. On her 3rd visit, she came upstairs afterward and sat across from Margaret at the workbench she had set up near the hatch opening and said, "I need to tell you what I've found." She said 2 of the paintings had provenance documentation that traced them to a family in the Netherlands whose collection had been seized during the war. She had been in contact with the family's representative, a granddaughter living in Amsterdam who was now in her 60s and who had grown up hearing about these paintings as lost. She said the representative had been told only that a possible lead had emerged and was being investigated, nothing more yet. Margaret said, "What happens now?" Dr. Meadows said, "Now the research is completed, the documentation is verified, and if the provenance holds, the paintings are returned to the family." Margaret said, "And I lose 2 paintings from the room." Dr. Mehta looked at her carefully and said, "Yes." Margaret said, "All right." She said it without hesitation, and Dr. Mehta's expression shifted slightly, a fractional change that Margaret recognized as something between relief and respect. She said, "Is there more? Any other items with similar questions?" Dr. Mehta said she was still working through the research. She said she would have a complete report within 6 weeks. She said Margaret should know that the paintings with clear provenance questions were 2 of the 4 Alton had identified as most significant. The other 2 appeared, based on the documentation available, to have passed through legitimate purchase before the war, which did not resolve all questions but placed them in a different category. Margaret nodded. She wrote this down. After Dr. Mehta left that day, Margaret sat alone in the room for a while. She did this sometimes, just sat, not examining anything, just being in the space. She had come to feel something in the room that she could not entirely describe. Not comfort exactly, not peace, but a quality of settled presence, as if the room had a patience of its own that she had been slowly learning to share. She thought about the family in Amsterdam, a granddaughter in her 60s, grown up hearing about paintings her family had lost before she was born. She thought about what it would mean to that woman to have them returned. She thought about the weight of things that had been taken and the weight of things that had been kept waiting and the different qualities of those 2 weights, and how one of them was a burden and one of them was a gift. She thought about how her own grief had felt like a weight, and how the room had felt like a weight, and how the folder with the bank numbers had felt like a weight, and how at some point in the past several months the quality of the heaviness had changed without her noticing exactly when, had shifted from the weight of loss to the weight of something that was going somewhere. She did not cry in the room. She saved that for the car, the drive home, where she had learned to let it happen because it happened anyway, and there was no point in fighting it, and the county roads at that hour were empty enough that it didn't matter. The provenance research concluded in early spring. Dr. Mehta's full report identified 2 paintings. For restitution to the Dutch family, 1 additional document whose origin required further research, and a set of stamps that appeared connected to a collection dispersed from a family in Vienna, whose descendants were located through a heritage organization and notified through the appropriate channels. Everything else in the room, after exhaustive research, showed no unresolved claims. The day the restitution of the 2 paintings was finalized, Margaret received a letter. It had come through Gerald's office, forwarded from the heritage organization handling the Dutch family's case. It was written in English that was correct and careful in the way of someone writing in their 3rd or 4th language, choosing each word with visible deliberateness. The woman who wrote it said her name. She said she was the granddaughter. She said she had been told about the paintings and about the woman in America who had found them and who had immediately, without being asked, agreed to their return. She said her grandmother had described these paintings to her when she was a girl. She said her grandmother had described them the way you describe the face of someone you loved who was gone. She said she had not, in her life, expected to see them. She said, "I do not know how to thank you properly. There is no proper way for this kind of thing. but I want you to know that you have given something back to my family that we had stopped believing could be given back. You have done this without being required to. That is the kind of thing that changes how a person understands the world." Margaret read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table. The refrigerator hummed. The rosebush outside the window was an early leaf, the small tight green of new growth. She folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, where she kept it for a long time. The formal auction process for the remainder of the collection was organized by the house Alton recommended, a major international firm whose specialists came to the property in April and conducted their own assessment over 3 days. Their numbers, when they came, confirmed and in some categories exceeded Alton's preliminary range. The collection as a whole, reduced by the restituted paintings and the Vienna stamps, but otherwise intact, was assessed at a value that made Gerald, in his measured professional way, remove his reading glasses and set them down on his desk and look out the window for a moment before continuing. He looked back at Margaret and said, "You understand what these numbers represent?" She said she was beginning to. He said, "Your current financial situation, the mortgage arrears, the medical debt, the tax obligations, all of it is resolved many times over. But beyond that," he paused. He said the numbers they were discussing represented a transformation of a different order. He said she should take time and think carefully about what she wanted her life to look like. She said she had been thinking about it. She had been thinking about it since November, since Alton had first given her his preliminary range in the ruined kitchen with the gray boards and the debris along the baseboards. She had been thinking about it quietly, not in terms of things she would buy or places she would go, but in terms of shape, the shape of a life, what it looked like when the weight of it changed character, what you did with your hands when you were no longer spending all their energy just holding on. She had made some decisions. She would pay the mortgage arrears and the medical debt and the tax obligations. That was the floor of it, the ground. That was the rosebush surviving the winter. She would keep her job at the library for now, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because the work was good work, and she knew how to do it, and she was not in a hurry to stop being someone who knew how to do something. She would establish a fund through Gerald's office, something structured and permanent, for the preservation and study of displaced cultural objects. She had talked to Dr. Mehta about this at some length, and Dr. Mehta had said, with the controlled enthusiasm of a professional who has learned not to get ahead of themselves, that this was exactly the kind of resource that did not exist in sufficient measure, and that the need for it was large and ongoing. She would call Renata and tell her everything. She had been waiting to do this until she understood the full picture, and the full picture was now in front of her, assembled from months of patient, careful work by people who knew what they were doing, and she was ready. She called Renata on a Sunday evening in late April when the light outside was long and golden and the rosebush in the yard was fully leafed, and there were small tight buds forming at the tips of several canes, the first bud since Daniel had planted it. Renata answered and said, "Mom," and then said nothing else because something in the single syllable of how Margaret had said her name told her that this was not an ordinary Sunday call. Margaret said, "I need to tell you something. I need to tell you the whole story from the beginning. Do you have time?" Renata said, "I have all the time there is." So Margaret told her. She started with the auction listing she had found by accident at 4 in the morning, clicking through tax deferral websites. She told her about the $200 and the broken windows and the yard full of dead brush. She told her about the hatch in the floor and the cold air rising from it and the sound of the house exhaling when the seal finally broke. She told her about Dolores and Alton and Gerald and Dr. Mehta and the woman in Amsterdam and the letter in her coat pocket. She told her about the paintings and the coins and the stamps and the documents. She told her about the numbers. Renata was quiet for a long time after Margaret finished. Then she said, "Mom." She said it again, differently. She said, "You did all of this by yourself." Margaret said, "I had help." Renata said, "You found it by yourself. You made the decision by yourself. You kept it together by yourself until you knew what you were doing." Margaret looked out the kitchen window at the rosebush. The buds at the tips of the canes were opening, just beginning, the first pink edge of petal visible in the evening light. She said, "I had help from Daniel, too. Not in any way I can explain exactly. But I think about him every time I go out there. I think he would have loved the whole thing. The hatch in the floor. The room in the dark. He would have been down that ladder before I finished telling him about it. Renata laughed, the real kind, the kind that had tears behind it. She said he absolutely would have. They talked for 2 hours. When they said goodbye, Renata said she was coming to visit in June, and Margaret said yes. Please come and see it. Come and stand in the room. After the call ended, Margaret sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house and looked at the folder that had lived on the table for nearly a year. The one with the bank numbers, the mortgage arrears, the medical bills, the tax notices. She picked it up. She held it for a moment. Then she got up and put it in the recycling bin. She went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept the whole night through. The sale was conducted over 2 auction sessions in June, the paintings in the first, the coins and stamps and documents in the second. Margaret attended both in person, which had not been required, but which she had wanted. She sat in the rooms and watched the proceedings with the particular quality of attention she had been developing for months, the librarian's attention, the attention of someone who understood that you could only know the value of something if you had done the work of understanding it completely. The first session's total exceeded the upper end of the assessed range. The numismatist who had appraised the coins shook her hand afterward and said he had not seen a collection of that consistency come a market in his professional lifetime. The second session's total, combined with the first, produced a number that she had written in her notebook when Alton had first given her his preliminary range and had looked at every few days since then, not with acquisitiveness, but with the particular checking quality of someone who needed to confirm that the world had not rearranged itself back into the shape it had been in before. It had not rearranged itself. The number held. On the drive home from the second session, Margaret stopped at a garden center. She had been meaning to do this for weeks. She bought 2 new rose bushes, a deep red climber and a pale yellow shrub rose, both healthy, both already in bud. She loaded them carefully into the back of her car and drove home and planted them herself in the evening, one on either side of the original bush Daniel had planted, the one that had survived the winter while he hadn't. She had dirt on her hands when Dolores called to ask how the session had gone. She stood in the yard with the phone and told her the numbers, and Dolores was quiet and then said, "Well, just that, well," in the tone of someone for whom that one syllable contained several paragraphs. Margaret said, "I'm planting rose bushes." Dolores said, "Of course you are." She said, "I want to take you and Alton to dinner when you're both free. Somewhere proper." Dolores said she would arrange it. After the call, Margaret knelt back down beside the new roses and pressed the soil firmly around the root ball of the yellow one. The evening was warm, and the yard smelled of turned earth and new growth and the distant particular sweetness of whatever the neighbors were growing along the back fence. A bird was singing somewhere in the tree at the yard's edge, a long liquid run of notes that meant nothing except that it was evening in spring, and that was enough reason. She thought about the room. It was empty now, the shelves bare, the workbench clear, the drop cloths folded and removed. She had been back after the appraisers finished their work before the auction, just to stand in it one last time. She had stood in the center of the room and looked at the bare shelves and the concrete walls and the ventilation grills that had done their job for decades in the dark, and she had felt the same quality of settled presence she always felt there, unchanged by the absence of the objects, as if the presence lived in the space itself rather than in what the space contained. She had thought about the man named Varek who had built it. She had thought about what he had known and what he had been trying to do and whether he had died hoping someone would eventually understand. She thought she might never know his whole story. The provenance research had produced pieces of it, fragments, but no complete account. That was all right. Not all rooms gave up everything they contained. Some things remained in the dark, not as secrets exactly, but as the natural limit of what the light could reach. She thought maybe that was enough. To have found what she found, to have done what she did with it, to have returned what needed returning and honored what needed honoring and held carefully the things that had been waiting to be held carefully. She had come back up the stairs and closed the hatch for the last time and replaced the loose panel in front of it, which she did not know why she did except that it felt right, except that some gestures were about respect rather than function. She had driven home through the county roads with the windows down and the spring air moving through the car and the sense of something completed, not ended but completed, which was a different thing. She thought about Daniel. She thought about how he had said for 3 years that he would fix the refrigerator next year. She had finally had it repaired the previous month, as part of a general going through of the house, a practical address of the small, accumulated deferrals of the past several difficult years. The repairman had said the compressor was original and had lasted far longer than it should have, and he didn't know how. She had told him she didn't either. The refrigerator was quiet now. No hum. She had expected to find the silence a relief. Instead, she found she missed the sound slightly, in the way you could miss the sound of something that had been irritating for years once it was finally gone, because the irritation had been a kind of company. She pressed the soil down around the last rosebush and sat back on her heels in the evening yard and looked at the three of them, the original and the two new ones, their roots touching in the soil under the surface, their canes reaching upward in the warm air. She thought the place looked better with more roses. She thought a lot of places looked better when you added things that grew toward light. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees and went inside and washed her hands and stood at the kitchen window in the quiet, clean-smelling kitchen and watched the yard go slowly darker as the evening drew in. She would call Renata in the morning and confirm the June visit. She would call Gerald about the foundation paperwork, which was nearly complete. She would write back to the woman in Amsterdam, properly this time, not the brief acknowledgement she had sent through the Heritage Organization, but a real letter, the kind that said what she actually wanted to say. She would go to work Tuesday, and shelve returns and answer reference questions, and help a small boy find a book about trains, and help an elderly man print a document he couldn't get his computer to print, and do the work that was good work and that she knew how to do. She would do all of this in a life that was no longer the same life it had been when she sat at this table in the dark at 4 in the morning, clicking through tax deferral websites with $216 in her checking account and a folder full of numbers she could not look at directly. She would do it as herself, which she had always been, through all of it, even when she had not been sure of very much else. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed and slept without lying awake first, which was not a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. Outside in the yard, the 3 rose bushes stood in the dark, their roots reaching down through the soil, their canes patient and upright in the warm night air, holding their buds until morning when the light would come back, and there would be more reason to open. There was always more reason to open. The letter from Amsterdam arrived on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary kind of day, the kind that did not announce itself with weather or ceremony, but simply proceeded in the ordinary way of Tuesdays, one task following the next. The library opening at 9, and the first patron arriving at 9:15, and the returns cart needing to be emptied and shelved, and the holds list needing to be printed, and the day going forward in the manner of days that have no intention of being remarkable. Margaret found the letter in her mailbox when she got home. It had come through the post this time, not through Gerald's office, not forwarded through the Heritage Organization's channels, but directly, the address written by hand in the careful English of someone who had composed it many times in their head before setting it down. She recognized the name in the return address. She had seen it in Dr. Mehta's reports. She stood in the driveway with her coat still on and the mail in both hands and read it twice before going inside. The woman's name was Elise. She was 64 years old, and she lived in Amsterdam in an apartment that overlooked a canal, though she did not say this in the letter, and Margaret was constructing it from other details, from the way she described the light in her city, the particular gray gold of autumn afternoons on water. She had worked for 30 years as a schoolteacher. She had retired the previous spring. She had 3 grandchildren. She wrote about her grandmother. She wrote about sitting in the kitchen of her grandmother's house as a child, a house that smelled of cardamom and old wood and the particular dry warmth of well-heated rooms in northern climates, and listening to her grandmother describe the paintings. Her grandmother had not described them often. It was not something she could do without cost. But occasionally, in the late afternoons when the light changed and something in the quality of the air seemed to permit it, she would talk about the big one, the landscape with the cloud formation in the upper left corner that her own father had called his argument with God, because it was so enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the small portrait of the woman in dark clothing that had hung for years at the top of the stairs and whose eyes, her grandmother said, followed you in the way. That good portraits did, not intrusively, but with a quality of attention that made you feel seen. Her grandmother had stopped talking about the paintings by the time Elise was a teenager. Not because the grief had diminished, but because it had calcified into something she carried privately, a weight whose shape she had learned to accommodate. She had died at 87 without knowing where they were. Elise had continued the looking in a desultory way for years afterward, registering with organizations, filing the paperwork, following the occasional lead that went nowhere. She had been doing it long enough that she had stopped expecting it to yield anything. She had been doing it the way you do things you have stopped believing in, but cannot bring yourself to stop doing, out of loyalty to the dead if nothing else. Then Dr. Mehta had called. Elise described this in the letter. She said she had been in the middle of making dinner when the phone rang, and she had almost not answered it, because she was in the middle of something and the timing was inconvenient, and she had a policy now of not answering unknown numbers. She had answered it anyway. She said she did not know why. She said maybe she had always known, in some underground way, that there was a call she needed to answer. She wrote, "I want you to know what happened when I saw the photographs. Dr. Mehta sent them to me by email that same evening, the high-resolution images your expert team had taken for the provenance research. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table where I had eaten dinner by myself, as I do most evenings, and I opened the email and I looked at the photographs." She wrote, "I recognized the landscape immediately. I had never seen it in person. I was born after it was taken, and yet I recognized it. My grandmother had described it so precisely, the cloud formation, the way the light fell across the middle ground, the specific green of the fields at the lower edge. She had described it so many times over so many years that I carried an image of it inside me that was as real as memory, more real in some ways, because it had been formed from love rather than from experience." She wrote, "I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the photograph on my laptop screen, and I understood that my grandmother had been right about every detail. I understood that she had carried an accurate image of this painting inside her for the rest of her life after it was taken from her family. That she had never exaggerated it or idealized it. That her love for it had not distorted it. She had simply remembered it truthfully, and she had passed that truth to me, and now I was looking at the thing itself." She wrote, "I'm not a person who cries easily. I'm telling you this not to claim credit for composure, but because I want you to understand that what happened next was not my ordinary way. I cried for a long time. I cried for my grandmother and for her father, who had called the cloud formation his argument with God. I cried for the years between the taking and the finding. I cried for my grandmother dying without knowing. And then I cried for something else, something I had not expected to feel, which was gratitude of a kind that I do not have an adequate word for. Gratitude to you, a woman I have never met, who found these things and who chose, without being required to choose, to do the right thing." Margaret read this part several times. She read it standing in the kitchen still in her coat, and then she sat down and read it again. The refrigerator was quiet. The rose bushes outside were in their late autumn state, the leaves gone now, the canes bare, the whole structure of them visible in the way that was only possible once the leaves had fallen, the architecture of the thing revealed. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the particular way that loss reshaped itself over time, not diminishing but changing form, finding new containers. She thought about a woman in Amsterdam sitting at a kitchen table alone and opening a photograph on a laptop screen and recognizing something she had only known through a dead woman's love-careful description. She finished reading the letter. At the end, Elise had written that she would be coming to New York in the spring for the formal handover of the paintings, which was being arranged through the Heritage Organization and the auction house as a properly documented ceremony of restitution, and she wanted to know if Margaret would be there. She said she understood if the logistics were complicated or if Margaret preferred not to attend. She said she would understand either way, but she wanted to ask. Margaret put the letter down on the kitchen table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she got up and found a piece of her good stationery, the kind she bought once a year and used for things that deserved it, and she sat back down and wrote back by hand. She said yes. She would be there. The spring ceremony was held in a room at the auction house that had the hush of places that handled important things carefully. There were representatives from the Heritage Organization and from the Dutch government's cultural ministry and from the auction house itself. And Dr. Mehta was there, and Alton Webb, who had taken a train down from where he lived and who stood near the back of the room with the contained stillness of a man who had spent 50 years in rooms like this and still found them meaningful. The paintings were already there when Margaret arrived. They had been mounted temporarily on the wall of the room, the landscape and the portrait side by side, lit properly for the first time in what was likely decades, the light falling across them the way good light fell across good paintings, revealing rather than performing. She stood in front of the landscape for several minutes before anyone else arrived. She looked at the cloud formation in the upper left corner. She thought about Elise's grandmother describing it as her father's argument with God. She looked at it and thought, yes, she could see why. It was enormous and layered and utterly indifferent to the green fields below it, and there was something in that indifference that was not cruel but simply true, the truth of the scale of things, of weather and time, and the smallness of any individual claim against the world's vastness. She thought about the room under the floor. She thought about the ventilation grills doing their work in the dark for decades, keeping the air moving just enough. She thought about whoever had sealed the paintings in there and what they had known and what they had hoped. Elise arrived 20 minutes later. She was a tall woman, upright in the manner of people who have spent decades at the front of classrooms, with gray hair cut short and eyes that were the particular clear blue of someone who looked directly at things. She saw Margaret before Margaret saw her, and she crossed the room without hesitation and took both of Margaret's hands in hers. She said, "You look like someone who did the right thing." She said it simply, as a statement of observation, not as flattery. Margaret said she had just tried to understand what was hers and what wasn't. Elise said, "That is harder than it sounds. Most people do not try at all." They stood together in front of the landscape. Elise was quiet for a long time, her hands at her sides now, her gaze moving across the surface of the painting with the same quality of attention Margaret had seen in Dolores and Alton, the attention of someone reading something carefully. But it was different too. It was the attention of recognition, of reunion. She said, "My grandmother was right about the light." She said it quietly, almost to herself. Margaret said nothing. Some moments did not need addition. The formal ceremony was brief and dignified. Documents were signed. Photographs were taken for the official record. Speeches were given that were shorter than they might have been and better for it. At the end, a representative from the Dutch ministry said something in Dutch that was then translated, something about the return of lost things and the work of restoration and the importance of individuals who chose to act with integrity when they were not compelled to. Alton caught Margaret's eye from across the room and gave her a single nod. That was enough. Afterward, there was a small reception in an adjacent room, and Margaret found herself standing with Elise near a window that looked out onto the street where the ordinary life of the city moved past in its ordinary way. Taxis and pedestrians, and the particular indifferent energy of a city that contained everything and noticed nothing. Elise said, "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said yes. She said, "When you found the room, when you first opened it and went down and saw what was there, what did you feel?" Margaret thought about this honestly. She said, "The first thing I felt was cold. The room was cold and I had not brought enough layers." She said, "And then I felt something that I've been trying to name ever since. Not excitement exactly. Something more like recognition. Like something that had been out of order for a long time had found its correct arrangement." Elise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, that is what I felt when I saw the photograph. Not excitement. Recognition." They stood at the window a while longer. Outside, the city went about its business. Inside, in the next room, the two paintings hung on the wall in good light, seen properly for the first time in decades, their surfaces doing what good paintings did, which was to be more present than the room around them, to exist with a particular insistence that had nothing to do with their financial value and everything to do with what they had been made from, which was attention and time and the particular human need to make something that outlasted the making. Margaret flew home the following morning. She drove from the airport through the familiar landscape of the route she had driven for 20 years, the exit she knew without reading the signs, the particular sequence of bridges and overpasses and the long straight stretch where you could see, on clear days, the water tower of her own town rising above the tree line. She stopped at the garden center. It had become a habit of hers, stopping there when she passed it, Not always buying anything, but looking the way you looked at things you had come to find nourishing. She bought a small, climbing rose she had been considering for several weeks, a variety she had read about that flowered twice in a season, once in early summer and once again in September, which she appreciated for its refusal to be finished. She planted it that afternoon on the fence at the back of the yard, training the first canes upward along the wire she had strung for the purpose. Her hands were dirty and her knees were damp from the ground, and the late afternoon light was doing the thing it did in this season, going golden and long and generous, laying itself across the yard with an abundance that felt almost excessive, almost too much, and was exactly right. She thought about Elise on the plane home. She thought about her grandmother carrying a precise and accurate image of a painting for the rest of her long life. She thought about the particular fidelity of love, how it preserved the things it touched, how it kept the details accurate even across decades of distance, how it was in some ways the most reliable form of archival storage that existed. She thought about Daniel and the rosebush and the refrigerator and all the next years that had been folded into that single word, next, all the time that had been assumed and had not arrived. She thought about how grief was also a form of preservation, how the things you loved did not diminish in their absence, but became more precisely themselves, held in the amber of attention. She pressed the soil around the base of the new rose and sat back and looked at the yard. For roses now, the original and 3 additions. The yard that had been just yard was becoming something slowly, without a plan exactly, just the accumulation of good decisions made one at a time. She thought that was probably how most good things happened. Not from a plan, but from the patient practice of the next right thing, one after another, in whatever order they presented themselves. The light went slowly off the yard, and she stayed until it did, and then she went inside and washed her hands and stood at the kitchen window in the quiet, clean kitchen and looked at the yard in the dusk, at the 4 rose bushes standing patient and bare-caned in the cooling air, their roots down in the dark soil, holding on. She was all right. She had known this for some time now, but it continued to be true, which was not something you could take for granted. It was something you noted with gratitude each time you found it still there. She was all right. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.